We have three speakers. They have about maximum 20 minutes each, and then we still have half an hour to discuss matters.
Okay, good. Nice start. So, thank you very much to the organizing committee and to the Sussex team for organizing such an interesting event. I would like also to thank Manolis, which unfortunately is not here. My presentation is linked to the measures and policies intended to reduce the brain drain. It is a legal approach. It was based on a comparative study of several legislative measures, and it is a theoretical one. I will just mention that we try to understand the legal measures in comparison to some results, economic ones and some data, but it's not the core of our study. Now, just to define the brain drain as the main term I am using, the brain drain is a phenomenon which consists in talented and experienced trained workers, which means scientists, in fact, who tend to emigrate from developing or impoverished countries, which means not poor from the beginning, but they get impoverished after a crisis. And those countries usually have a lack of scientific facilities. This is a subjective approach, which means a lack of facilities from the point of view of scientists themselves. Now, these scientists go to developed and wealthy countries, which are called research centers. And here again we have a subjective approach. A research center is something which is conceived as such by the scientific community itself. And their aim is to find employment which corresponds to two aims, let's say qualification, which is again something objective, but also career ambitions, which is something which depends on every scientist himself. The result of the brain drain is, of course, the shrinking of the critical mass of researchers, and it creates a drop in the quality of research and a destruction, finally, of the scientific potential. Now, as you probably know, Greece was able for several years, and is still able today, to produce scientists. However, it was unable at the same time to absorb all these highly skilled workers. On top of that, the crisis just aggravated the phenomenon, and we have a massive emigration of these workers. To examine the question we said, which is what measures can be adopted by a country to alleviate the negative effects of the brain drain, we start by examining the Constitution. As you know, the Constitution is setting the main guidelines for the government and the state authorities to take measures. Now, what is very interesting for us is that our Constitution in Article 16, paragraph 1, first sentence, specifies that research is free, science and research is free in Greece, therefore it has to be protected by the government. But in addition to that, the government is obliged to promote and support scientific research. In theory, this means three main things. First of all, scientific research is free. It is free for all citizens, but it is also free for foreigners. It is free for physical persons, but also for legal entities. And it is the main right to protect scientific research against infringements. In addition to that, we have freedom to select methods and objects of the research under the conditions that these will be legal, that the research will be undertaken regarding team research, because we always have individual research, but this is not creating issues, let's say. Regarding collective research works, it has to be undertaken in legally created research institutions. And always, it is a main point, we have to take into account the rights of participants or of third parties, which can be patents, protections, etc. I would like to underline the following. When we refer to the freedom of research, we refer to scientific works. This means that it has to be scientific, and what is scientific, what is accepted as scientific by the scientific community through peer review and all these mechanisms. And just to mention an example, we do not refer to astrology, okay? It has to be scientific works.
However, by all means, we can put limitations on the right to conduct research with a precise manner, okay? It has to be done in a precise manner, which means objectively, in a transparent manner, etc. And for a main purpose, in case we could have harm for public safety, public health, etc., and always with due respect to the principle of proportionality. Now, all this refers to the protection of scientific research. In addition to that, we have the obligation to support scientific research in Greece. What does this mean? Well, it is not clear. We don't know what scientific research encompasses precisely, and here I'm referring to the activities. Do we have an obligation to promote nuclear physics research, or do we have an obligation to promote microbiology researches? We don't know. We just know that it has to be scientific research works. However, since it is a constitutional right, we have two limits. The first one, upstream, let's say, is the obligation not to put such conditions so as to, let's say, affect the substance of the right. We cannot put a prior authorization requiring to pay, let's say, 1,100 euros to be able to conduct research. This would be, this would equal to prohibit the research work. On the other hand, this does not mean that we have an unlimited right. Okay, we cannot conduct research on a fellow or on a patient without taking into account his right to life, to decency, etc. We have these two limits. Inside these two limits, however, there is what we call the freedom of research, which is still vague. This means that we do not have a specification of what these activities consist of. And the problem is, of course, that we do not have a specification from the courts. The courts are reluctant to precise what this refer to. They just mention these are the main decisions of the Council of the State, 1934, it's very old, 1989, it's also old for us, but the point is that they just mention in general prior authorization, in general that it is an individual right, etc. This is not the point, however, today. The point is that we have a brain drain that affects scientific research as a whole. So, could we say that the government is allowed to take any measure to support scientific research in Greece? This could be the conclusion of what is said in the Constitution. Now, to make a long story short, the answer is no. The government is not allowed, let's say, to take any measure it deems necessary due to its EU membership. To open a parenthesis, and this is based on a comparative study, the measures which could be adopted to alleviate the negative effects of the brain drain could vary from creating incentives to incite, let's say, scientists come back to the country, like tax incentives, job employment opportunities, etc., to prohibit, to try to dissuade scientists to leave the country. And such a law was adopted in the 80s in the United States, where they tried to impose on scientists to pay back, let's say, a certain part of the amount the government had invested in their education. We cannot take such measures. All this discussion in my first paragraph is based on the existence of two contradictory, let's say, principles. The one is the freedom of research, but the other one, and it is duly argued, is that there is an obligation, let's say, a duty to assist the country which invested in you and created a scientist. Obligation to pay back. In practice now, what happens? Well, as an EU member, Greece is obliged to adopt laws supporting the main guidelines. In our topic, this is related to the establishment of the European research areas. It was proposed in 2000. It is more and more being elaborated today. The main idea is to have a coordination of research infrastructures and efforts, and funding, of course, and to allow brain collaboration, circulation, remove all barriers which would consist in an impediment to researchers' mobility, and to allow scientific work in any country of the EU. All these are codified, of course, in binding documents. Now, what could be done in this context? What Greece tried to do, let's put it this way, thank you, was to adopt measures aiming mainly at changing the atmosphere in order to create an atmosphere of trust. In addition to some tax incentives which were already in place, here are the dates, 2013, 2010, 16, these are some minor tax incentives, let's say. A whole reorganization of the research was proposed in 2015, aiming at developing some specific research areas such as agriculture area, IT, energy, etc., coupled with strategic tools, which are mainly dissemination of knowledge, patent pools funding, etc. Of course, in the context of the European guidelines, and in coordination with a stable augmentation of research and development expenditure. In practice, this is what is important for us lawyers, let's say, because this is only binding. At the legislative level, a new law was adopted in 2016, which, and this was the innovation of the law, specified the core content of Article 16, mentioning what was to be adopted by the government, precise actions, like the creation of installations, facilities, etc., precise action levels, national, regional, etc., the aim, transition to a competitive regime, and the actors involved, public and private as well. Regarding the executive measures at the executive level, we had the enhancement, the promotion, let's say, of, how can I put this, through the celebration of specific events like Science Day, Science Festival, etc., they tried to influence, and this is also a specific guideline which comes from the EU, tried to inspire new generation of scientists to get involved in the science work. In addition to that, specific platforms were created at an official level to allow the linkages between members of scientific community inside the country or with the private sector inside and outside the country, etc. Now, what is the result? This is also very important. There's no need to examine a legislative measure without trying to understand what the result was. Okay, I'll try to be as objective as possible. The country, Greece, still has a very good potential. Okay, despite the crisis, the scientific potential of the country was not destroyed, and this is very important. The ranks regarding innovation worldwide, these measurements were from the Global Competitiveness Report, of the Global Economic Forum. The rank for innovation is quite good, 85 out of 137 countries, and the scientific workforce measures were taken according to scientific publication, H index, etc., which are very objective measurements, are still good. 65 out of 137 in a country with such a low R&D expenditure is a good rank. It is good. It is objectively good. However, the country is still unattractive for talents. This means that we cannot attract new talents and we cannot keep the Greek scientists who are leaving. These are the results. To give you a point of reference, just to understand and to be able to make a comparison, in China during the last years, in fact since the 90s, there is a very strong and precise policy to make scientists get back to the country. The incentives, to have an idea, compared to what we adopted in Greece, was in addition to specific job opportunities and to healthcare, etc., to all members of the scientist family, was a premium of 350,000 euros for every scientist deciding to get back to the country. It is obvious that such an amount, it was not possible for Greece to give it to in the context of such policy. However, This is, until here it is the negative part. However, we have to take into account an additional phenomenon, which is the following. We have, let's say, limited efforts at the legislative or executive level, but we have in addition to that a very strong social pressure. This means articles and actions and various, let's say, initiatives which are undertaken by privates or Greeks in the country or outside, which is saying, testifying, let's say, a change in mentalities. It is clearly showing that people are not anymore accepting what we call the brain drain phenomenon. And based on this social pressure, maybe we could assume that in the following years we could have some better results. That's it.
I'm sure we're all getting hungry by now, so I'll try to keep this brief and concise. I'm Eleni Tseligka. This is what I'm presenting today. Can you find the keys? Yeah. It is part of a larger research. Took 18 months of field research in Germany. These are the locations I visited for participant observation and semi-structured live interviews, which was followed, of course, by thematic and semiotic analysis. The end of the Second World War found Greece in ruins, with most of its infrastructure destroyed and more than 500,000 dead. 1/4 of all villages laid to waste, and a great proportion of the rural population internally displaced, seeking refuge in the cities, yet failing to integrate, thus remaining unemployed, horribly poor, and with little hope for future improvements. The general malnutrition of the population, paired with a shortage in medical supplies and inadequate sanitation conditions, resulted in the resurgence of tuberculosis and malaria. The end of the Second World War, however, did not signify the end of bloodshed for Greece, but the beginning of a 4-year civil war which claimed the lives of an additional 158,000 people and caused further destruction of public and private property. The outcome of that war solidified Greece's position in the Western Bloc during the Cold War era. Between 1947 and 1952, the Bank of Greece came under American supervision, which maintained the stability of the drachma, but led to gold coin hoarding, since people did not trust banks with their savings. Despite its downsides, being a member of the Western Bloc and since 1951 of NATO, secured much needed funds for Greece that was included in the Truman Doctrine, which established an era of US involvement in European politics. The photos you see behind me were taken between 1964 and 1968 by a Greek-American photographer called Konstantin Manos. These are not people posing in costumes. These are people in rural parts of Greece, particularly those parts that send a lot of people in Germany as guest workers, wearing their actual clothes and going about their actual business. So that idea you have of Greece, which comes from colored movies, from famous films, where tradition is usually the subject of the joke, it's part of the comedy of the film, is a rather constructed idea of a westernized Greece that, if it existed at all, it did not exist in the rural poor areas. Germany's state after the end of the Second World War can only be described as a big pile of rubble. Most major cities, but also many towns and villages, have been heavily bombed during the final stages of the war, and most of the country's infrastructure was reduced to ash and debris. During the 1950s, while Greece's economy was almost entirely depending on loans and foreign aid, the economic growth rates of Germany became so impressive that it was considered an economic miracle. By the 1960s, Germany was already regarded as one of the world's rich countries, yet growth slowed down mainly because of a drop in the flexibility of the labor supply. Germany now stood divided into two separate states. The regime in East Germany had made emigration to the West a very dangerous affair, so the flow of workers from East Germany to West Germany had dramatically decreased. And in August 1961, with the building of the Berlin Wall, it stopped altogether. In order to solve the problem of a growing labor deficiency, the West German government signed bilateral agreements which allowed foreign individuals to enter the labor force of Germany. A new term was created in the German language to describe the newly arrived workers from the south, Gastarbeiter. It means guest workers. The term described the legal status of immigrants with few rights and a temporary position in the German society. Those photos are mostly property of the Museum of Immigration in Cologne. The ship Kolokotronis is a legendary ship that carried Greeks to Brindisi, and from there they would catch a train to go to Munich station. Platform 11, Gleis 11, also known as the Platform of Hope. The 1960 bilateral agreement with Germany was advertised as a solution to individual poverty, encouraging people to migrate. The sudden industrialization of the economy, followed by the urbanization of the population, both of which began right after the war, resulted in unprecedented unemployment in Greece. It is, however, difficult to put the problem in numbers, as statistics from that era are generally considered unreliable due to methodological fallacies and the systematic efforts of the Greek government to conceal the poor state of the economy. After the agreement was signed, Germany created a very efficient system to link employers to foreign employees. First, the employers had to apply to their local employment office, declaring how many workers they needed and the skills those individuals should have. Then the employment office would search for workers that were already registered with them in the country, and if they could not find any, they would contact German officials in one of the countries which had agreed to dispatch workers. The German committee in Greece maintained two recruitment offices, the first in Athens at Viktoros Hugo Street, near Omonia Square, and the second in Thessaloniki at Dodekanissu Street. The guest workers played an important role in the development of the German economy from the 1960s onwards. Their presence created an economic order and policy which was growth-oriented, and some of them introduced new improved skills and work ethics into the job market. Of course, immigrants were not the only factor that took the German miracle to the next level. Technological advances and scientific innovations like nuclear power or the transistor and later the microchip, which brought forth a new generation of computers, along with the participation of the West German state in the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and the European Payments Union, allowed the country to create a highly competitive economy, rebuild itself, and leave its World War II past behind. The Europeanization of Germany was seen as a crucial element in the reconstruction of the German state after the disaster of the Second World War. Thomas Mann's dictum of a preferred European Germany instead of a German Europe was taken literally by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who since the 1950s initiated the multilateralization of German politics as the best means to overcome Germany's past and solidify the country's position in the West. The photos are from various dormitories where guest workers were living. In the 1970s, German society was already concerned about the social consequences of foreign labor recruitment, as it became apparent that those who were regarded as guest workers were in fact immigrants, and in their majority they were not interested in repatriation. Foreign labor recruitment was banned in November 1973, but most of the immigrants did not go back to their country of origin, mostly out of fear that they would not be able to return to Germany if the situation in the home country was not what they expected. A family reunification law and new policies that would assist integration and eliminate social discrimination were introduced in the 1970s by the German government. A new curriculum was introduced to schools along with ethnically mixed classrooms to encourage integration and help create a new paradigm regarding the place of guest workers in the German society by exposing Germans to a heterogeneous social model on the one hand, and on the other hand teach foreigners German. Greek guest workers at work. Most black and white photos in my presentation are property of the Museum of Immigration in Cologne. The living conditions of those Greeks who decided to stay in Germany would soon begin to improve, as on the 1st of January 1981, Greece became a full member of the European communities, including the European Economic Community, the predecessor of the 1993 configuration of the European Union. The changes brought forth by the agreement would progressively bring into legislation the free movement of goods and the free movement of persons, services, and capital. The above development also promoted social mobility, as people gave up their old jobs in factories to start their own businesses. That increased social mobility cleared the air from the negative stereotypes of the past, such as the poor Greek gastarbeiter, who is a manual laborer, allowing the Greek community to be seen under new light by the German public and even enhancing the concept of European identity. Photos are from present-day communal activities of Greek migrant associations and church parishes. Often quoted as an invisible minority, in contrast to the concept of a visible minority associated with racial minorities, Greeks had reached the highest level of integration in the German society to the point that their presence was considered an essential element of contemporary Germany. At the same time, the ease of relocation within the European Union became one of the pull factors for the new wave of Greek emigration. The case of resettlement and the equal treatment changed the qualitative aspects of Greek migration to Germany. The gastarbeiter of the 1960s and 1970s were by default unskilled or low-skilled workers in dire need for work. They fled extreme poverty and in some cases political persecution, and quite often they had mouths to feed at home. The European expatriates, however, left for Germany from a significantly wealthier Greece, to some extent due to the political and financial benefits of Greece being a European member state. A generation of European citizens has been raised to take mobility for granted, often experience life abroad at a young age by joining a European program such as Erasmus, designed especially to promote intra-European mobility of students and scientists. It is quite common for Greek European expatriates to have had their first migratory experience as students. Of course, the living conditions in Greece took a change for the worse since the beginning of the economic crisis, particularly due to the rise of unemployment, which reached 27% by the end of 2013. Those circumstances diversified the demographics of neo-migrants in Germany. Communal center in Düsseldorf. It is not easy to have a full picture of the new Greek migration to Germany. Greece does not keep records of expatriates except from those who have transferred their tax base abroad, who are, however, a small minority. Therefore, it relies exclusively on statistical records from the German state and Eurostat. However, European expats need a fixed address in order to register with the German authorities. This is part of the Schengen Agreement, which means that homeless Greeks or those residing in temporary accommodation are not being recorded. In addition to the lack of data from Greek authorities, the free movement of people within the EU allows irregular patterns of return migration, which often complicates data gathering. I'm almost done, thank you. The lack of secular and organized support system for neo-migrants was highlighted in many of the interviews I conducted. Newcomers first turn to the church and then perhaps to the Greek community, not the Greek state authorities. Some parishes have set up an informal support system which introduces neo-migrants to the institutions of the receiving state. However, other parishes are overwhelmed by the influx of neo-migrants and acknowledge that they are no longer in a position to help. Under the circumstances, neo-migrants who have not previously secured work are vulnerable to exploitation and extreme poverty, and of course homelessness. The migratory regime of European expatriation has made relocation between European member states easy for individuals, but the changed socioeconomic environment has become inhospitable and perilous for low-skilled workers. In the absence of state institutions to support the neo-migrants, the established diaspora is gathering its own resources to facilitate the integration of newcomers. The Greek Orthodox metropolis, along with Greek migrant associations and Christian charities of the Evangelical Church, like Diaconia, provide a safety net from impoverishment and homelessness. And I'm closing with a picture of a church-organized bazaar to collect money and send failed migrants back home. Thank you very much for that.